excerpt from the book In a Day's Work, starting at chapter 3, titled Behind Closed Doors and Without a Safety Net. Most afternoons, June Barrett leaves the Miami apartment that she shares with her twin sister to take a 10-minute cab ride to the wealthy suburb of Pinecrest, Florida. By about 5 in the afternoon, she arrives at the home of Raymond and Marjorie, a one-story structure as long as a football field decorated with mementos from the couple's world travels. Raymond and Marjorie are in their 90s. And in this house, they have raised 5 children, celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, and grown old together. It is here, in this home, that June Barrett does her work. A woman of boisterous good humor, Barrett is one in a rotation of 6 household workers who help Raymond and Marjorie with their most fundamental needs. Barrett typically begins her 16-hour overnight shift by preparing and serving the couples a 3-course evening meal. By request, shrimp appetizers and salad are on heavy rotation. After dinner, Barrett helps Marjorie through the standard bedtime rituals of brushing her teeth and changing her clothes. She also makes sure Raymond takes his medication and then helps him in the bathroom. Once the couple is asleep, Barrett cleans the kitchen, the dining room, and whatever else needs tidying. On some nights, she's able to take a power nap during her shift. Though, just as often, Barrett is tending to Marjorie throughout the night because the elderly woman, who suffers from dementia, can't manage to fall asleep. By about 5 in the morning, Barrett is giving Marjorie a sponge bath. An hour later, she helps Raymond take a shower. Then she makes breakfast and gets Raymond to set up his office so he can send some emails. By 9, she is headed home. Barrett's job, domestic work. It is the crucial but unseen labor done behind the closed doors of private homes. It is the intimate and invisible work that happens in someone else's bedroom, bathroom, and kitchen. As a profession, it takes on many forms, from tending to disabled or elderly clients to cooking and cleaning and watching an employer's kids. Some workers live in their client's home, and some, like Barrett, go home at the end of a set number of hours. But there are few fixed hours or norms in domestic work, and a caregiver can perform a multitude of tasks, since the way that people run their households or realize their daily rituals is personal and particular. Its broad range of conditions collides with the lack of industry regulations, so the risk of exploitation is real in domestic work, especially because it has been purposefully excluded from various federal laws meant to protect workers from abuse. Barrett's current job has become one of the best she's ever had in her 30+ years career. She says her employer, Judy Aberman, Raymond and Marjorie's daughter, treats her with respect and pays her fairly. Though there's little uniformity in the industry when it comes to wages, paid time off, and even the type of work that is required of domestic workers, Barrett says that Aberman pays her and her colleagues a good wage and has realistic expectations for what can be accomplished in a shift. Her boss also provides Barrett and her coworkers with paid sick days and a week of vacation each year, which employers are not required to do under federal law. Another prerequisite of her job, Aberman hands out a holiday bonus at the end of the year. They are critical to the quality of life of my parents' lives, Aberman says. How could you not take care of people who are taking care of your family? Not all employers operate with the same philosophy, and Barrett, who is originally from Jamaica, hasn't been spared the abuses that can come with her job. She took her first job as a domestic worker at 16 in Kingston after falling into the line of work out of necessity. Barrett and her twin sister had been orphaned when they were 2, and the girls were split up between family members and a few years later. Barrett was sent to live in the rural outskirts of Montego Bay with an aunt who, she says, grudgingly took her in and never let Barrett forget that she was not only a burden, but also too dark. When Barrett finished public school at 15, she says her aunt made it clear that she was no longer welcome in her home. Gusty and self-possessed, Barrett talked her way into a domestic worker training school run by the Methodist Church, where she learned to iron, clean, and cook. After 4 months, the church placed her in her first job with the family of a government official who lived in a large house in Kingston. Still a teenager, she found herself in charge of running a busy household. But the family she worked for didn't think Barrett moved fast enough. After what they deemed to be slow service during a social event, they turned her and made her pack her things. Going back to her aunt's house in the countryside wasn't an option, so Barrett hustled to find another job as a live-in domestic worker. Things become more complicated when she found out that she'd gotten pregnant by a man she was dating. He denied that he was the child's father, so she had to fend for herself. But without a job, she was also homeless. The pregnancy made her too sick to work, so she spent her days resting at the house with her twin sister working as a domestic worker. In the evening, she stayed with a friend. The rest of the time, she wandered the streets of Kingston. After a few months, she found a temporary job as a live-in domestic worker, but it was not the solution she had hoped for. When she was 8 months pregnant, her employer made a violent sexual advance towards her. Barrett didn't say anything because she thought that she would be blamed for it, though staying silent didn't help her either. She took out her outrage on the women in the family, and she was fired. Barrett found herself homeless again, and she had nowhere else to go but back to her family in the countryside. She knew her aunt most certainly wouldn't take her in, but it turned out that her older sister couldn't accommodate her either. The only option was to stay in a room in their small village with their ailing and bedridden grandmother. A couple of weeks after she arrived, with the help of a midwife, she delivered a baby in the room she shared with her grandmother. 10 months later, the baby died of meningitis. Barrett was devastated. She tried to cope with her loss by immediately heading back to Kingston to lose herself in work. The first job she found was with a couple who needed help around the house and childcare for their 2-year-old boy. The husband of the household was a loan officer at a nearby bank, and his wife had a long commute to a job at a phone company. Fairly quickly, Barrett began to feel uncomfortable around her male boss because he brought lovers home with him during his lunch hour. Before long, he graduated to fondling and touching Barrett whenever his wife wasn't around. Then, a few months into the job, he became more aggressive and raped Barrett while his toddler slept in the other room. It happened more than once. When he came back and did not have a woman with him, I knew I would be sexually abused that day, Barrett says. This was Barrett's most extreme experience with on-the-job sexual violence, though it wasn't her last. The ordeal served to reinforce how difficult it could be to extricate herself from a bad live-in job. What am I going to do? Barrett remembers thinking at the time. I'm not allowed to go back home. Am I going to be in the streets homeless? After 6 months, she took another job while trying to find other types of work. She enrolled in night classes at the local high school, focused on teaching technical skills, which led to a series of office jobs. She liked the work, but at her second job as an office administrator, a co-worker outed her as a lesbian, and word got out. She started receiving threats outside of the office. One man told her that he would rape her straight. The homophobia in her country made her fearful enough to spend her savings on a plane ticket to South Africa for a gay rights conference and to London, where she spent 8 months living with a group of friends from the Caribbean, which gave her the time to recover from the streets and the stress of life in Jamaica. She thinks back on her travels as one of the best times of her life. But the United States beckoned. Barrett was inspired by what she saw in the movies and in the news. She loved what America represented, a land of freedom and human rights, and she imagined feeling safe there. Barrett brought a plane ticket to New York. She had a few extended relatives in the Northeast, including a cousin in Connecticut, who picked her up from LaGuardia Airport. To earn a living, she went back to domestic work. She found a job in New Jersey caring for children of a divorced man. Barrett loved the work in the family, but although she had become a U.S. citizen in 2005, she didn't have authorization to work in the United States at the time. Her boss had no choice but to let her go. He was aware of that employing an undocumented worker was a risky proposition. It is illegal to hire undocumented immigrants, and though the government has historically focused on deporting workers rather than punishing employers, the consequences for companies and bosses include financial penalties and, in some cases, criminal prosecution. Meanwhile, workers in an industry who don't have the proper papers to work in the United States, whether they are hired to harvest vegetables or vacuum office buildings, operate from a position of economic precariousness. To get work undocumented, it was difficult, Barrett says. The challenge of finding a job without valid work papers was what kept janitors like Georgina Hernandez or farm workers like Blanca Ferro tethered to their jobs, even if they were mistreated or abused. Barrett found a way out of her predicament when her sister Judy came to the rescue. Her twin was living and working in Florida as a domestic worker, and she helped Barrett find a temporary living gig in Miami. Barrett took a Greyhound bus to the northeast of Florida. The job would give her room and board for a few months, but it didn't pay. While this type of arrangement is not uncommon in domestic work, it flouts minimum wage laws. Nevertheless, the job bought Barrett some time to figure out her next move. It also forced her to confront a discordant reality. As a domestic worker in search of the American dream, she had taken one in only a handful of jobs in the United States that has been excluded from laws meant to shield workers from abuse. Laws to protect workers in the United States from exploitation date back to the federal programs launched in the 1930s under the New Deal. Among the key legislative reforms was the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. Which gave workers the right to form unions and to bargain collectively for improved working conditions. Then came the Federal Labor Standards of 1938, which established requirements for minimum wage and overtime. As these laws were being drafted, domestic workers and farmers were purposefully excluded, a development that scholars attribute to the fact that they were jobs primarily done by African Americans. Thank you.